Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are immersing ourselves, maybe a little too literally, into the grandeur of antiquity. We're talking about the ancient Roman baths, the thermae.
Ah, yes, the thermae.
And when you picture them, you see this astonishing architectural triumph. You imagine gleaming marble columns, maybe shimmering mosaics on the ceilings,
Absolutely. Pure luxury.
and this scent of perfumed oils and steam. It genuinely looks like the peak of ancient civilization, doesn't it?
Mhm.
A real testament to their engineering, their sense of luxury.
And that's exactly the image the Romans projected, the image they wanted us to see. But our source material, and this draws really heavily on archaeological finds, medical texts from the period, it paints a very different picture.
Okay.
It pulls back that curtain on a reality that is, well, frankly, it's pretty gut-wrenching. We're going beneath that shiny veneer today
Right.
to reveal that these huge communal public facilities, from a modern health perspective, an epidemiological view, they were basically biohazardous incubators, just, disguised as these fancy luxury amenities.
Biohazardous incubators.
Wow.
Okay, so that's the core conflict we're digging into. Our mission, then, is to really dissect this system. Understand why these celebrated places were just so profoundly, almost spectacularly disgusting.
Mhm.
We're looking at this horrifying balance, right? Where Rome's incredible engineering skill, their genius, really, in moving massive amounts of water with aqueducts,
Yeah.
heating these cathedral-sized spaces.
Unbelievable engineering.
That created the capability to gather thousands of people. But then, their total absolute ignorance of germ theory that created the perfect conditions to basically manufacture and spread disease everywhere.
And what's so fascinating, I think, is that the advancement itself, the sophistication, it became the liability. When the life is simpler, diseases tend to stay more localized.
Sure, makes sense.
But Rome built this incredibly complex infrastructure. Its whole purpose was concentrating warm, nutrient-rich water and then forcing thousands of people to share it every single day.
Without any clue about pathogens.
Exactly. They essentially built this magnificent citywide petri dish and then invited everyone to come and marinate in it. It's quite a thought.
Marinate. Yeah, that's one word for it. Okay, let's start with the grandeur, though, because I think to really feel the horror, you have to appreciate the sheer scale of the genius involved first. We're not talking about, like, little local hot tubs by a river.
No, not at all. We're talking about massive complexes, sprawling structures that covered huge areas of land. Think about the baths of Caracalla or the baths of Diocletian in Rome.
Diocletian's baths.
Yes.
Those were enormous, right?
Staggering. The latter, Diocletian's, was so vast, estimates suggest it could hold something like 3,000 people, all at the same time.
3,000 people simultaneously. Just picture that.
And their architectural scope was equally immense because their purpose went way beyond just getting clean. The thermae were the absolute cultural, political, social heart of the Roman city.
More than just pools.
Oh, much more. Beyond the bathing rooms themselves, the frigidarium, cold, tepidarium 1, caldarium, hot, they had these expansive exercise yards, the palestra. That's where Romans went to work up a good sweat first.
Right, the pre-sweat.
Exactly. And they housed libraries, too. Gardens for quiet walks or contemplation. There were shops selling food, drinks, goods. And yes, the sources are pretty clear, often integrated brothels as well.
So like a self-contained city almost. A multifunctional ecosystem under one gigantic vaulted roof, probably echoing like mad, too.
Oh, the acoustics must have been something. And central to making this whole thing work, especially when it wasn't summer, was the heating system, the famous hypocaust.
Ah, the hypocaust, Rome's signature tech, really. An engineering marvel for climate control back then.
It truly was an incredible achievement. The hypocaust system, it worked using furnaces, usually called the prefernium, built right next to the main building.
Okay.
And slaves, an army of them, would be continuously feeding fuel, mostly wood, sometimes charcoal, into these furnaces around the clock.
It's constantly burning.
Constantly. And the hot air and smoke produced, it wasn't just vented out, it was channeled very cleverly through flues built into the walls and, crucially, beneath the floors.
Right, because the main floors weren't just sitting on the ground, were they?
No, exactly. They were raised up, usually about 2, maybe 3 feet off the actual ground level, supported by hundreds of these small pillars made of brick or stone. They're called pilae.
Pilae, okay.
So this hot air and smoke circulated through that entire cavity, that empty space, thoroughly heating the tile floor above it from below.
So you're walking on a floor that's literally radiating heat.
Yes. Often getting temperatures in the caldarium, the hottest room, that would honestly rival a modern Turkish bath or a really intense sauna. We're talking well over 110 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe -45 Celsius in some spots.
Wow.
And this whole complex mechanism, it wasn't just heating the air and the floor. It was also essential for heating the enormous tanks of water, often lined with lead, which were situated directly above or near the furnaces. That's how they kept those massive pools warm enough.
The sheer logistics of that, keeping those
Yeah.
fires burning nonstop,
Mm-hmm.
it must have required just legions of laborers and a terrifying amount of fuel. Deforestation must have been an issue.
Oh, absolutely. It points directly to the economics we'll discuss later, but the scale of the engineering effort alone is just staggering. It really shows you how vital the baths were considered.
Yeah, it wasn't a luxury add-on.
No, this level of investment tells you it was essential social infrastructure. It was, you could almost say, the central nervous system of Roman daily life. You really couldn't be a fully functioning Roman citizen without going to the baths pretty much every day.
I like that description someone used, the social media platforms of the ancient world. It feels right.
It really does capture it. Their function went so far beyond just washing. Reputations were made, they were destroyed inside those steamy, echoing halls.
Business deals struck while naked, apparently.
Often, yes. Political alliances were formed, plots were hatched, gossip was traded. It was the main stage where the entire social hierarchy of Rome performed itself every single day.
And this daily attendance thing, it cut across class lines, right? Everyone went.
Pretty much everyone, yes. That was one of the remarkable things. Romans from almost every social level visited the baths daily, but the timing often reflected your status.
Ah, okay. So not all rubbing shoulders at the same hour.
Generally not. The nobiliores, the wealthy elite, the senators, magistrates, they typically showed up in the mid-afternoon after the main business of the day was done.
Which left the evening slots for?
For the working classes, the plebeians, they'd arrive later, often tired, probably much grittier from a day of manual labor.
So you had this mix, but also segregation, primarily by gender, I gather.
Yes, that was the minimum rule. Women usually bathed separately from men. Either they had completely different, often smaller bath complexes, or they used the same facility but at different times, typically earlier in the day.
Okay, wait. If they had different timings, say women in the morning, men in the afternoon, did that help with the hygiene problem at all? Did they, change the water in between?
That's a really logical question. You'd hope so, wouldn't you?
Yeah. But the answer seems to be a pretty emphatic no. Whether the segregation was by time or by separate wings, the fundamental issue didn't change. It was the contamination of the standing water itself, the shared tools like strigils, the complete lack of germ knowledge.
So shuffling the schedule did nothing.
Absolutely nothing to solve the core problem of pathogen buildup. In fact, you could argue if women bathed first, they were just getting exposed to whatever festered overnight. And then the men came in and added their own unique biological contributions later in the day. The problem wasn't who was bathing when, it was the water turnover, or rather the lack of it.
Okay, let's dive into the actual bathing ritual, because this is where that contradiction between what they thought they were doing and the reality gets, well, shockingly clear. The Roman philosophy seems completely backwards to us now. It was like you had to get thoroughly dirty first, sweat out all the toxins, before you could even think about getting clean. That was precisely the idea. Open the pores, liquefy the grime that had built up, and, in their medical thinking, balance the body's humors. It was a whole process.
And it was standardized, like
yeah.
a set sequence.
Yes, pretty much. And it often took hours to complete. You'd start in the apoditerium, that's the changing room.
Okay.
You strip naked, maybe hand over your clothes, any valuables, to an attendant for safekeeping.
An attendant who I remember reading was often basically a known thief. So step one of getting clean involved a high risk of being robbed blind.
Haha, yeah, a charming start to the purification process.
That's the tone.
Indeed. So, from the changing room, you don't head for the water yet. No. First, you go to the palestra, the exercise yard.
Right, for the mandatory sweating.
Mandatory sweating, you needed physical exertion. Think wrestling matches, various ball games. They had several kinds, lifting weights, maybe some running. The goal was strenuous activity, designed specifically to work up a proper heavy sweat.
So you're deliberately getting coated in sweat, plus whatever dust is on the exercise floor, maybe dirt you tracked in from the street.
Exactly. And this lovely mixture of sweat and grime was considered crucial for the next stage.
Which was?
The application of oil.
Ah, the famous olive oil.
Yes. After exercising, you'd move into the tepidarium, the warm room, and there, slaves, or maybe you brought your own, would apply olive oil. And we're not talking a light spa-like moisturizing layer here.
No.
No, this was a liberal, thorough coating, head to toe, just slathered on.
Slathered onto the sweaty, dirty skin.
Precisely. And that oil immediately mixed with the heavy sweat, the dead skin cells sloughing off, and all the accumulated city grime, street dirt, dust particles, maybe even traces of animal dung tracked in on people's sandals.
Okay, I'm trying to picture this. It sounds less like cleansing and more
Yeah.
like creating a human dough ball. Just this thick, sticky layer of biological gunk clinging to you.
Yeah.
A human slug, maybe?
That's a very vivid and probably quite accurate image, if unpleasant. The result was exactly that, a dense, oily, biological sludge covering the bather's entire body.
And the theory was
What?
that the oil trapped the dirt.
The theory was the oil would bind with all the filth, all the muck, making it easier to scrape off. And that removal process, the scraping, brings us to the tool that is just absolutely central to this whole hygiene horror story.
The strigil.
The strigil.
That simple-looking curved metal tool, usually bronze or iron.
Simple in design, yes, but horrifyingly effective as a disease vector. It was perfectly shaped to scrape that oily sludge cleanly off the skin.
So you'd literally see ribbons of this stuff coming off people.
Exactly. Imagine these long, greasy strips of filth oil, sweat, dead skin, bacteria, street dirt, just falling directly onto the floor of the tepidarium.
Ugh, where we just pool in the corners or get trampled and spread around by the hundreds of other people walking between the rooms.
That's just the visible mess, the stuff on the floor. The truly critical detail, the one our sources really highlight, is that the strigil itself was the ultimate contamination tool. Why? Because it was often communal.
Communal, you mean shared.
Passed rapidly from person to person. A slave might scrape down a senator, maybe get some of that sludge on the tool.
Right.
Then immediately turn around and use the exact same uncleaned bronze strigil on a common laborer next to him, and then maybe on a wealthy kid after that.
Wait, hang on. You're saying they shared these scraping tools without even wiping them down properly, let alone sterilizing them?
Minimal cleaning, if any, between users seems to have been the norm, especially in the busy public baths, which implies a direct mechanical transfer of every single microbe, fungus, virus particle from one person's skin to the next.
Oh my God.
Think about it. Someone has a small cut, maybe an open sore, a weeping skin lesion, perhaps a bit of impetigo, or a patch of ringworm, which would have been common.
Yeah.
When the strigil scrapes over that lesion, it picks up that infectious material. Moments later, that same tool is dragged across the skin of the naked bather.
Potentially depositing that infectious gunk directly into any tiny scrape or nick they might have?
Yeah.
Like from shaving or just dry skin?
Precisely. It was an incredibly efficient, active method of cross-contamination. It basically guaranteed that whatever skin diseases were circulating in Rome on any given day were going to be efficiently transmitted to pretty much everyone who used that bathhouse.
It's just staggering that a society that built the aqueducts could perform this ritual daily and apparently not connect the dots with the rampant skin diseases and sickness. But again, it comes back to that fundamental blind spot, doesn't it?
It really does. The complete lack of understanding about the invisible world of microorganisms. The ignorance of germ theory is the absolute foundation of this crisis.
They were so advanced in other ways.
Incredibly advanced. Structural engineering, road building, logistics, even military medicine, battlefield surgery, treating wounds. They had some sophisticated knowledge there. But when it came to microscopic biology, bacteria, viruses, the actual life cycle of pathogens, they were completely in the dark.
So disease was caused by, what, bad air?
Bad air or miasma, yes, that was a dominant theory. Or an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. That was the framework, which tragically led them to believe that as long as the water looked clear and didn't smell foul, it must be safe.
And they were piping all this visually clear water from those magnificent aqueducts into these enormous, beautiful pools. Surely the sheer volume of fresh water constantly coming in must have helped a bit, especially in the biggest imperial baths. Offered some dilution factor.
You'd absolutely think so. It seems logical. But the reality is the water turnover problem was just abysmal, even with the aqueducts providing a constant inflow.
How abysmal are we talking?
Well, while fresh water did flow in and old water did drain out, the rate of exchange, the actual replacement of the total volume, was pathetic by any modern public health standard. Think about a modern public swimming pool. Regulations often require the entire volume of water to be circulated and filtered roughly every 6 hours, sometimes even faster.
Okay, 6 hours. What was the Roman equivalent in a big public bath?
Huh. Well, our sources, archaeological evidence from drainage systems, suggest that in the largest public thermae, the main pools, especially the huge natatio or swimming pools, They were rarely drained and cleaned completely.
Rarely meaning.
Sometimes days, occasionally, potentially even weeks between thorough cleanings in the really massive complexes. They'd top off the water level to keep it full, sure, compensating for splash out and evaporation. But they weren't consistently replacing the massive standing volume itself.
Okay, let's do the contamination math again. So the bathers, they've done the exercise, they're covered in sweat and dirt, they've been slathered in oil, scraped down, and they did not shower before getting into the pool.
Correct. There was no pre-cleansing shower. As we established, getting into the pool was the final cleansing step. That's where you washed off the residual oil and grime.
Which means every single person entering that pool was shedding everything left over. Olive oil, sweat, dead skin cells, whatever biological sludge didn't get scraped off, plus whatever was on their feet, all into a finite body of warm standing water.
Exactly. And you multiply that continuous biological load by the hundreds, maybe thousands of people using that pool every single day. The contamination level just increased exponentially hour by hour. It created this thick, soupy, diluted biological stock, a human stew, a slow cooker for pathogens.
And the temperature just made it all so much worse. It turned this human stew into the perfect incubator.
Absolutely. This detail is so critical. The Romans liked their baths hot. They kept the water in the coldarium and even the tepidarium, often somewhere between 80 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's roughly 27 to 38 degrees Celsius.
Which is not just comfortably warm.
No, it's precisely the ideal temperature range for many pathogenic bacteria to thrive and multiply. It's their sweet spot.
Why is that range so dangerous, biologically speaking?
Because that's where their growth rate, their doubling time, is fastest. Under ideal conditions, warmth, moisture, nutrients, a bacterium like E. coli can double its population roughly every 20 minutes.
That's 20 minutes.
And that bathwater, that biological soup filled with dead skin, oils, sweat, maybe traces of other things, that's nutrient-rich broth for bacteria. So you have the perfect temperature, plenty of food, and you keep adding new bacteria from hundreds of bathers for hours on end with very slow water turnover.
You're basically achieving exponential bacterial multiplication.
That's exactly what was happening.
Yeah.
Our sources, combined with modern microbiology, show that species like E. coli, which is a key indicator of fecal contamination, would have flourished, as would Staphylococcus species, notorious for skin infections, and various streptococcal species. They didn't just build baths, they unintentionally built highly efficient bacterial farms, and then they swam in the product.
Okay, if the general grime and the bacterial soup weren't bad enough, we have to talk about the Roman attitude towards actual bodily waste in these public spaces. This is where that image of the sophisticated society just completely clashes with basic hygiene.
It is a really stark contradiction, isn't it? Let's start with urination. In the pools. Far from being some shocking taboo, it seems it was widely accepted. Maybe even expected by some.
Expected, why?
It stemmed from this flawed understanding of chemistry. They believed that urine, specifically its ammonia content, actually had cleaning properties.
Well, they weren't totally wrong on the chemistry, were they? I mean, ammonia is used in some cleaning agents, albeit diluted.
It does have mild antimicrobial properties, yes. And the Romans had probably observed this superficially, maybe noticed it helped cut grease or something, but this was such dangerously incomplete knowledge.
How so?
They focus on this tiny, almost negligible potential disinfectant effect while completely ignoring the massive load of pathogens and other biological contaminants that human waste introduces into water, especially bacteria from the urinary and gastrointestinal tracts.
And we know this wasn't just an occasional accident. People were doing this deliberately.
We have pretty good evidence. The Roman satirist Martial, who wrote in the late 1st century AD, he frequently complained in his epigrams about fellow bathers who would just relieve themselves right there in the pools instead of bothering to use the designated latrines.
Which were available in the bath complexes.
Oh yes, large bath complexes had extensive latrine facilities, often quite elaborate communal ones. But clearly not everyone used them, or used them consistently.
So Marshall's complaints tell us two things.
Exactly. First, the behavior was common enough to be a noticeable social nuisance, something worth writing satire about. And second, notice how he frames it. It's a lapse in manners, it's rude, maybe it makes the pool smell bad. It's not framed as a public health catastrophe, because they simply didn't understand that aspect. It was annoying, but not deadly in their view.
Okay, the acceptance of urination is shocking enough, but what about the other, defecation? Surely that wasn't tolerated.
That was, at least theoretically, forbidden. We know this because writers like Pliny the Elder, again around the 1st century AD, mention specific rules and regulations that explicitly prohibited fouling the baths.
The fact they needed a rule against it.
Precisely. The very existence of rules against defecating in the baths strongly implies that people were doing it often enough to make such regulations necessary. It suggests that, especially in crowded conditions with thousands of people, basic sanitation discipline just completely broke down sometimes.
And again, this isn't just speculation based on texts complaining about bad manners. Archaeology gives us the grim proof.
Archaeology gives us the undeniable physical proof. Analysis of the sediment and material recovered from the actual drain systems connected to Roman bathhouses. It's provided unambiguous evidence.
What do they find in the drains?
Exactly what should never, ever be in bathing water. Significant quantities of preserved human fecal matter, and along with it, identifiable parasitic worm eggs, specifically eggs of intestinal parasites like whipworm, Trichuris trichiura, and roundworm, Ascaris lumbricoides, which are passed in feces.
Wow. Direct biological evidence.
Direct biological evidence. This residue confirms a severe systemic lack of sanitation discipline within the baths themselves. It proves that bathers were regularly, perhaps constantly, exposed to active fecal contamination in the water they were soaking in. The entire system was practically built upon facilitating the fecal-oral route of disease transmission.
Right, so we've got this warm-standing soup of human grime, bacteria, urine, and apparently feces. Lovely. Now let's look at the other ways diseases were guaranteed to spread, even outside the pool itself. Let's go back to that olive oil, the luxury product that became a major disease vector.
That contaminated olive oil, it really was a biological time bomb waiting to go off on everyone. It wasn't just the sheer quantity they used, it was the whole process, the application method, and the reuse.
Slaves applying it with bare hands.
Bare hands, moving quickly from one patron to the next to keep up with demand. The potential for cross-contamination was just limitless.
I'm picturing the same slave's hands, maybe having just handled the dirty feet of a laborer with athlete's foot, then moments later applying oil to the face or torso of a wealthy child or a senator.
Exactly that scenario. The same hands that touch someone with an active weeping skin infection, maybe a staph infection, maybe that ringworm we mentioned, would immediately smear that infectious material directly onto the healthy or maybe slightly broken skin of the next person in line.
And you mentioned reuse. They didn't just discard the excess oil.
No. The oil that dripped off during application or was scraped off by the strigil and fell onto cloths or maybe collected somehow. Sources suggest this was often collected and poured back into the main storage vessels to be reused.
Oh, that's horrifying. So they were essentially creating this concentrated biological suspension.
Precisely. This reused oil became progressively more biologically diverse, as you might politely put it, with every single application. It just got thicker and richer in bacteria, fungi, dead skin cells, and who knows what else. Every bather both contributed to and was subsequently exposed to the shared toxic oil suspension. It's truly a masterclass in how not to handle communal hygiene.
Okay, with the combination of shared strigil scraping skin and shared contaminated oil being smeared everywhere, it's absolutely no surprise that skin diseases must have been rampant, spreading through the thermae like wildfire.
Completely endemic. The environment was perfect for it. Warm, moist conditions are ideal for fungal growth. Think ringworm, athlete's foot, things that love warm, damp skin folds and floors. And bacterial skin infections like impetigo, caused by staph or strep bacteria, would have spread incredibly easily through direct contact, shared tools, shared oil. Plus, parasites like scabies mites would have transferred readily in that close environment. People with active infections were constantly shedding these pathogens onto the floors, onto benches, into the oil, and ultimately into the communal water.
Yet, the Roman medical writers, people like Galen, they described these skin afflictions in detail, didn't they? But they completely missed the connection to the baths.
They describe the symptoms very well, yes. Roman medical texts are full of descriptions of various rashes, sores, itching conditions, fungal infections. They absolutely knew bathgoers suffered frequently from these things, but because they lacked microscopes and germ theory, they attributed them to the wrong causes.
Back to the bad air and humors.
Exactly. It was blamed on miasma, or an internal imbalance of the humors. So the prescribed solution was never stop sharing dirty scraping tools and soaking in contaminated water. It was things like changing your diet, bloodletting, or applying various herbal poultices, which were usually ineffective and sometimes contained toxic ingredients themselves, like lead compounds.
Okay, so you dodged the oily skin diseases. You still had to worry about the towels, right? The textile hazards.
Absolutely. Towels and drying cloths were another major vector. They were often shared among multiple bathers, and crucially, they were washed infrequently.
And how were they dried?
Usually right there in the bath's warm, incredibly humid environment, maybe draped over the hot benches or near the hypocaust outlets. This warm, damp cloth is the perfect breeding ground for bacteria and mold. A towel might look and feel dry, but it could still be teeming with millions of microorganisms from the dozen people who used it before you.
Ready to transfer to the next person's eyes or face or broken skin?
Precisely. Eyes are particularly vulnerable to infections transferred this way.
This constant exposure to microscopic threats brings us right back to the water itself and the parasites. Those invisible bugs that only need you to swallow a tiny amount to get really sick.
Yes, the conditions in those warm, fecally contaminated pools were absolutely ideal for waterborne parasites like Giardia lamblia and Cryptosporidium.
Cryptosporidium. That one rings a bell from modern outbreaks, doesn't it?
It does. Crypto is particularly nasty because its cysts are famously resistant to standard chemical disinfectants like chlorine, a fact the Romans obviously had no clue about nor the means to address, even if they did. These parasitic cysts can survive in the water for long periods, just waiting to be accidentally ingested.
Just swallowing a mouthful of pool water.
Exactly, which must have happened constantly, especially if people were swimming or splashing. And I recall seeing analysis suggesting that chronic diarrhea was just a constant fact of life in ancient Rome.
It seems to have been extremely common, yes. Our sources, medical texts and letters, frequently describe debilitating persistent stomach sicknesses, fluxes, dysentery-like illnesses that Romans struggled to treat effectively. And the baths were likely the main culprit.
It's highly probable that these chronic diarrheal diseases were maintained by a continuous cycle of reinfection, perpetuated largely by the baths. People accidentally swallowing contaminated water or maybe even transferring pathogens via hands to food eaten afterwards. It ensured a constant biological assault on their digestive systems. Just think, a single person shedding Giardia cysts into that warm, crowded pool could infect hundreds, sustaining that infection cycle within the community for weeks on end.
So when you scale all this up,
Mhm.
thousands of people, many of them probably carrying active infections, maybe asymptomatically, all gathering for hours every day in this warm, steamy, communal Petri dish. The spread of serious systemic diseases must have been just devastating and continuous.
It was basically a finely tuned machine for creating and sustaining epidemics. Think about systemic diseases transmitted via that fecal-oral route we keep mentioning. Things like typhoid fever, cholera, various forms of dysentery. They would have absolutely thrived in the thermae.
How would an outbreak start?
Easily. If just one person with an active infection, maybe even someone who felt perfectly fine but was shedding the bacteria, an asymptomatic carrier, used the pool, their pathogens were instantly introduced into the communal water supply.
And accidental ingestion was almost guaranteed.
Almost inevitable for many people. A single typhoid carrier shedding Salmonella typhi into that water could easily trigger a localized outbreak affecting hundreds of people across the city who visited that bath. It's a terrifyingly efficient distribution system.
And it wasn't just the waterborne stuff, was it? The whole environment was perfect for respiratory diseases, too.
Oh, absolutely. Those crowded, hot, steamy rooms, especially the caldarium, were ideal environments for spreading airborne diseases. Think about tuberculosis. TB was a major killer in ancient Rome. We know that from skeletal evidence, too.
How would it spread in the baths?
Easily. People spent hours in close proximity, socializing loudly in those echoing halls, talking, laughing, probably coughing and sneezing too. All of that creates aerosols, tiny airborne droplets containing saliva and pathogens.
And the steam helped spread them.
Exactly. The circulating steam and warm, moist air within those often poorly ventilated, confined, heated spaces would have efficiently distributed these infectious aerosols everywhere. It was the perfect storm for respiratory transmission.
And this is where the Romans' architectural genius actually backfired on them, health-wise. The hypocaust systems gave them amazing heat, but they also created hidden problems, didn't they, like dampness?
They absolutely did. That space beneath the raised floor, between the pilae pillars where the hot air circulated, it was often damp. Water could condense down there, maybe leak from pipes, and pool in those relatively unventilated subfloor cavities.
Leading to?
Rampant, unchecked mold growth. All sorts of fungi would flourish in that dark, warm, damp environment.
And the spores?
Those molds would release literally billions of spores. And where did the hot air carrying those spores go? Straight up through vents and gaps into the bathing rooms above. So bathers weren't just inhaling bacteria and viral particles from each other, they were also breathing in huge quantities of fungal spores constantly.
Which would cause what? Respiratory irritation? Allergies?
Chronic respiratory irritation, certainly. Coughing, wheezing, potentially triggering asthma-like symptoms or more serious fungal lung infections in susceptible individuals. And the general humidity was also a problem. Relative humidity in some rooms probably exceeded 80% routinely. That turns every surface marble, stone, plaster into a potential biofilm, a slimy layer where microorganisms can thrive.
And on top of the biological hazards, we also need to consider chemical contamination from cosmetics washing off.
Yes, that's another layer to this toxic soup. Wealthy Romans, both men and women, were often fond of quite elaborate cosmetics, and many of these were dangerously toxic by our standards.
Like what?
Lead-based powders were very common for whitening the face. Antimony sulfide was used for darkening the eyes and eyebrows kohl. Mercury compounds were sometimes used too.
And these would just wash off in the bath.
As they sweated, applied oil, scraped it off, and soaked in the pools, yes, these heavy metals would inevitably wash off their skin and into the water,
Contributing to the general sludge.
contributing heavy metals to the sludge. Now imagine people spending hours soaking in this water, maybe accidentally ingesting small amounts. Chronic, low-level exposure to lead, antimony, mercury through contaminated bathwater could certainly have contributed to long-term health problems, especially lead poisoning, which can cause cognitive decline, neurological issues, anemia, problems that some historians think may have plagued Rome's elite. They were literally soaking in poison.
Can we actually see the physical impact of all this constant disease exposure on the Roman people themselves? What does the skeletal evidence show? Does it confirm this picture of widespread sickness?
Oh, the skeletal evidence provides really disturbing, tangible confirmation of chronic ill health across the population. When archaeologists and paleopathologists analyze skeletal remains from Roman-era cemeteries, they frequently find telltale markers of chronic systemic infections and the stresses they cause.
Such as
One of the most revealing markers is something called enamel hypoplasia.
enamel hypoplasia. Okay, break that down for us. What is it?
It's basically a permanent scar left on the teeth, recording severe stress or illness experienced during childhood when the teeth are forming. Tooth enamel develops in layers over time as a child grows.
Right.
Now, if a child experiences a period of severe systemic stress, like a really bad infectious disease with high fever, such as typhoid, measles, or severe dysentery, or even serious malnutrition, the body goes into crisis mode. It prioritizes immediate survival functions and temporarily halts non-essential processes, like building tooth enamel.
It just stops making enamel for a bit.
It pauses the deposition of enamel. When the child recovers from the illness or stress period, enamel formation resumes. But that temporary halt leaves a visible defect, a horizontal line, a groove, or a pit in the tooth surface, a permanent record of that sickness episode.
Wow. Like rings on a tree, but for childhood diseases.
Exactly like that. And the key finding is that Roman skeletons, particularly from the imperial period when the baths were most popular, often show multiple distinct enamel hypoplasia lines on their teeth, meaning that the average Roman likely experienced several episodes of severe body-wide illness during their childhood and adolescence. Illnesses serious enough to disrupt their growth. And given the bathhouse environment, it's highly probable that many of these illnesses were waterborne or communicable diseases picked up through constant exposure in the thermae.
That is incredibly direct evidence. And it brings us to this really profound, almost tragic irony of Roman civilization, doesn't it?
It really does.
They prided themselves so much on their baths. Their elaborate bathing culture was held up as proof of their superiority, their cleanliness, their civilization, compared to the so-called unwashed barbarians on their borders.
It's the ultimate historical twist, isn't it? Their most celebrated symbol of civilized life, their complex, magnificent bathing infrastructure, when combined with their scientific blind spots, might have actually made them less healthy overall than the very people they looked down upon.
So the unwashed barbarian had an advantage.
In a way, yes. Think about Germanic tribes, for example. They simply lacked the technology and infrastructure for Roman-style mass communal bathing. They weren't concentrating thousands of people into warm, shared water daily. So while their hygiene standards were certainly different and they faced their own health challenges, they likely avoided the hyper-efficient concentration and distribution of fecal, oral, and waterborne pathogens that the Roman thermae essentially perfected.
So the complexity itself became the problem.
The sources really drive this home. Technological sophistication does not automatically equal better sanitation or health. In this case, it arguably led to worse outcomes on a population level.
It's easy to just blame their ignorance of germ theory. But you mentioned earlier that economics played a huge role, too. It wasn't just that they didn't know better. There were powerful financial incentives pushing them towards filth, weren't there?
Absolutely. This is a fantastic, large-scale, historical example of the economic concept known as the tragedy of the commons. Running a big public thermae wasn't cheap. It was a massive industrial operation.
All that fuel for the hypocost.
Exactly. It required enormous quantities of wood or charcoal to keep those pre-Fernia furnaces burning 204/7. And it needed a constant, massive supply of water from the aqueducts. Both fuel and water were expensive, resource-intensive inputs.
So the people running the baths, the operators, they were under constant pressure to cut costs and maximize profits.
Constant pressure. They had a very strong financial incentive to minimize the biggest operating costs.
Yeah.
Fuel consumption and water replacement.
Which translates directly to
Keeping the existing water in the pools standing and heated for as long as humanly possible before going through the expense and effort of draining, cleaning, and refilling. And trying to cram as many paying customers through the doors per fill as they could. Maximize bather volume per water fill. That was the economic logic.
And didn't they keep the entry fees really low? Which would have made the volume game even more critical.
They did. The admission fee for most public baths was kept deliberately, almost absurdly low, often just the single quadrants. That was the smallest denomination Roman coin, worth maybe 164th of a silver denarius.
And a denarius was roughly a day's wage for a laborer.
Something like that, yes. A few denaries, maybe. So the bath fee was basically negligible, almost free. This ensured the baths were accessible to nearly everyone, fulfilling their social function.
But if the operating costs were high and the entry fee was tiny, how on earth did the operators make any money?
Primarily through sheer volume, packing people in, and by ruthlessly cutting corners on maintenance, cleaning, and especially on that expensive water turnover. They had to prioritize volume over hygiene to stay profitable.
And no one could afford to be the clean bathhouse.
It created a market dynamic, a race to the bottom. Any operator who tried to maintain significantly higher hygiene standards, changing the water more often, cleaning more thoroughly, would have much higher operating costs. They'd have to charge a higher entrance fee.
And customers would just go to the cheaper, dirtier competitor next door.
Exactly, because the primary drivers for most Romans were the low cost and the essential social function, not necessarily pristine water quality they couldn't even properly assess. So economic pressure basically locked the entire system into a state of unavoidable baseline filthiness.
Did the Romans try any sanitation measures? Or was it pure neglect driven by cost cutting?
Oh, they certainly tried things. But their efforts were severely limited by their lack of understanding. Their attempts at hygiene mostly focused on what they could see.
Like skimming the surface.
Yes. Staff would periodically skim the surface of the pools with nets or maybe perforated ladles to remove obvious floating debris, hair, leaves, maybe chunks of oily scum, general trash that got thrown in.
The ancient equivalent of picking the chunky bits out of spoiled milk, as you put it earlier.
Pretty much. It made the surface look a bit better, removed the aesthetically unpleasant stuff. But it did absolutely nothing to remove the dissolved contaminants, the biological films coating the surfaces, or the billions of suspended microscopic organisms, the bacteria, the viruses, the parasite cysts.
Did they add anything to the water? Like chemicals?
They did experiment with additives, often for supposed therapeutic reasons rather than pure disinfection. We know they sometimes use substances like sulfur compounds, maybe mineral salts. Sulfur does have some genuine antimicrobial properties.
That might have helped a little.
The problem was dosage. The concentrations they used were likely far, far too low to have any meaningful disinfecting effect on those enormous volumes of warm standing water that were constantly being recontaminated with fresh biological material. It was like adding a teaspoon of bleach to an Olympic swimming pool, basically useless.
So, when the great Roman baths eventually declined and many closed down, centuries later, was it because people finally realized, hey, these things are making us sick? Was there a public health awakening?
It's remarkable, but no. The decline and eventual closure of most large public baths in the Western Empire coincided with the gradual fragmentation and collapse of Roman political and economic systems from the 3rd century AD onwards.
So it was about infrastructure failure.
Primarily, yes. It was infrastructural collapse and economic hardship. Cities and the state could no longer afford the enormous logistical burden of maintaining the aqueducts, fueling the massive hypocaust furnaces, and organizing the labor needed to run these complexes. The complex system simply broke down. It was political and financial failure that shuttered the baths, not a sudden, collective realization of the public health disaster they represented.
That's fascinating. It's really instructive then to compare the Roman model with other communal bathing cultures that came later or existed elsewhere. Did they learn lessons the Romans missed?
Definitely. If you look at the Islamic hammam tradition, which inherited and adapted many aspects of Roman bathing, they introduced some crucial public health improvements.
Like what?
Critically, hammams often placed a greater emphasis on running water and washing with water, rather than just soaking in massive standing pools. Many designs incorporated continuous flow-through water systems. Water was brought in, used for washing or pouring over the body, and then rapidly drained away. This significantly reduced the bacterial accumulation compared to the Roman slow cooker pools.
Makes sense. Less standing water, less time for stuff to grow.
Exactly. And then you have Japanese bathing culture, the onsen, hot springs, or the public sento. They embody the absolute key difference.
Which is?
The fundamental non-negotiable ritual requirement. You must thoroughly wash and scrub your entire body with soap and water outside the communal tub before you are allowed to enter the shared hot water.
The pre-bath wash.
A mandatory pre-bath wash.
Yeah.
That single step dramatically reduces the amount of dirt, oil, sweat, and bacteria, the biological load that each person introduces into the shared water. It completely avoids the core flaw of the Roman system, where the pool itself was the cleaning mechanism, thereby guaranteeing its contamination.
We live in an age of chlorine, ozone, UV filters, strict regulations for public pools and hot tubs. But the underlying principles haven't changed, have they? We still face similar challenges if we get complacent.
Absolutely not. The fundamental physics and biology of waterborne disease transmission are constants. Our advantage today isn't that the dangers have gone away, it's that we understand them and have the technology to mitigate them if we use it properly.
But negligence can bring back old problems.
For sure. Complacency or negligence in maintaining modern systems creates the same old dangers. Think about inadequately maintained hotel hot tubs. They offer that same risky combination. Warm, agitated water shared by multiple people. If the disinfection, like chlorine levels and filtration, aren't rigorously maintained, they become perfect breeding grounds for pathogens.
Like Legionella.
Exactly. Legionella bacteria, which causes Legionnaire's disease, thrives in warm water systems. Or chlorine-resistant parasites, like Cryptosporidium, can cause outbreaks even in pools that meet basic chlorine standards if filtration fails or contamination events occur. We still have to actively fight the same biological reality the Romans were utterly blind to, and that requires constant vigilance, proper investment in maintenance, and adherence to scientifically sound regulations. #outro.
So we've really picked apart the history, the science, the economics.
Yeah.
And it leaves us with this absolutely fascinating and frankly quite terrifying contradiction. The Roman baths. Architecturally brilliant, socially indispensable, yet at the same time, utterly and spectacularly disgusting. They were basically fountains of disease, just disguised as fountains of health and civilization. They applied such unbelievable precision and engineering skill to moving water, yet they completely mistook that technical ability for an actual understanding of what was living in the water.
Yeah. And I think the sources really show us a profound historical lesson here, one that resonates today. Technological sophistication and public health or sanitation are absolutely not the same thing. They don't automatically go hand in hand.
Right.
In fact, as the Roman bath example shows so clearly, advanced technological capability, when it's paired with a critical gap in scientific knowledge, especially about invisible biological or environmental realities, can actually become a powerful vehicle for concentrating and distributing harm much more efficiently than simple systems ever could.
It really makes you rethink how we look at ancient ruins, doesn't it? We visit places like the baths of Caracalla today, and they seem so sterile, so magnificent, these silent monuments to Roman genius.
Silent and clean now, yes.
But to truly grasp Roman daily life, you have to mentally repopulate those vast empty pools. Imagine them filled not with clear water, but with murky, lukewarm, contaminated liquid. You have to add the smell, the body odor, the dampness, maybe urine, add the noise, the crowds, and overlay it all with that invisible cloud of bacteria, viruses, and fungal spores hanging heavy in the steamy air over those marble benches. That was the reality.
It paints a very different picture, and it leads, I think, to a final kind of provocative thought for you, our listeners, to mull over. The Romans focused on visible grandeur, visible cleanliness, and completely missed the microscopic truth that was undermining their health.
So the question is,
What magnificent, complex infrastructure or celebrated technological achievement of our own era, something we rely on daily, maybe think is purely beneficial, perhaps related to our energy systems, our food production, our digital networks, our chemical environment? What aspect of our advanced world might future historians look back on and realize was, in fact, silently concentrating or distributing harm on a massive scale? What critical piece of microbiological or environmental or maybe even social or psychological knowledge are we right now potentially missing? What unseen factor allows our own sophisticated civilization to perhaps inadvertently distribute harm instead of promoting well-being, all in the name of progress?